back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Maria and today's video is just going to be my November wrap up. So basically all the books I read in November, giving you my thoughts and feelings, how I rated them, and letting you know if they're books that I would recommend. So I think November was a pretty good reading month for me. I think I read around 13 or 14 books. Some of them were rereads and I'll skim over them very quickly at the start, but a lot of them were continuations of series that I'm in the middle of at the moment, and then found a couple of new faves as well. So definitely a good reading month overall, I would say. So the two rereads that I done were Kingdom of Ice from Throne of Glass, so that's the last book in the Throne of Glass series, and also A Court of Thorns and Roses by SJM ReRead. So if you're new here, you may not know, but I'm basically doing a reread with some of my friends on bookstagram, so Selin and Madison, and we done this last year in anticipation for House of Flame and Shadow, which was coming out in January. So we done a bit of a reread together. Decided this year just to do it for fun because we had a lot of fun last year just rereading series that we love, going through all the theories, trying to work out our own theories, see all of the connections. Most of them are pretty unhinged, but it's just a really fun time. So I did reread both of those. Both of them are 5 stars. They're some of my favourite series, so I won't go too deep into them, but yeah, really enjoyed rereading those this month. And the rest of the reads this month were all new to me reads, so some were new authors, some were series that I've had on my TBR for such a long time that I'm really glad I'm starting now as well. So yeah, we'll go through all the books I read, get yourself a drink, get yourself cozy, and without further ado, let's just get into the wrap up. Okay, so the first book I read in November was Queen of Air and Darkness by Cassandra Clare, and this is the third in the Dark Artifices series within the Shadowhunter world, and I think this is like book 12 or something like that within the Shadowhunter world. It's something in and around there anyway. I've been slowly making my way through the whole of the Shadowhunter series, and over the past few months I've decided to pick up the Dark Artifices trilogy, and really glad I picked this up. It's ended up probably being my second favourite trilogy within the Shadowhunter world so far. The first would probably still be the Infernal Devices, which is the second trilogy you're supposed to read. It came pretty close. So as this is the third book in a trilogy but also like the 12th book within a world, there's not too much I can tell you about the synopsis for this one. But what I will say is this was the perfect conclusion to a trilogy. If you love urban fantasy or any fantasy that has kind of angst, forbidden love, friendship or found family, you need to read this trilogy, and basically just the Shadowhunters world in general. It's a series I never read when I was younger, and a lot of people obviously do say it is a YA series, so a lot of people read it when they were young and it's quite nostalgic for them, but just from my personal experience, obviously picking this up for the first time as an adult, it's still really hitting a chord with me. I'm still feeling that I relate to the characters even though they're quite young. I can relate to some of the older characters in here as well, so it's kind of nice to have that hybrid and being able to relate to both kind of sides of the story. But I do think that just the way Cassandra Clare writes is really beautiful, and you really get invested in her characters, and the stories are really great. There's always like a mystery plot or something like that going on in the background, but for me the characters that she writes and the relationships that they have are just second to none. They're really good. So if you haven't jumped into this world yet, or if you've been anticipating it or a little bit apprehensive, I've been reading it over the last couple of years, so I've just been picking up the trilogies as I go along, and it's really approachable. It seems like a lot of books, but if you kind of just break it down into those trilogies, it doesn't seem as daunting. So definitely, if this is a series that you've been looking to pick up, put it under your 2025 TBR because you won't be disappointed. So next up in November I read Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson, and this is a standalone within his kind of world, so I wanted to continue my reading with Brandon Sanderson. I have read the Mistborn trilogy, enjoyed the first one. The second and the third were just okay for me, but I really do want to kind of delve into more of Brandon Sanderson's work, so I thought this was a good starting place for just getting back into his writing style, getting back into his world, and I did end up really enjoying this one. Basically this one follows two sisters who also happen to be princesses. So one is supposed to go off to another land to marry the God King, and the other is kind of a wayward child who is supposed to go into like a nunnery or something like that, and we're basically just following their lives and following their journeys throughout this land. And there's a few different kind of storylines going on here, and this is definitely one of those ones where it's a ragtag group of people. They all have disparate stories at the start, but they all kind of tie together by the end of it, and I think he done it really masterfully. I really enjoyed it. It definitely didn't disappoint. I think the magic system in here was quite unique but also simplistic to understand, so it is high fantasy, but I always find with Brandon Sanderson's writing it's not too difficult to comprehend, and he usually does give you some good pointers as the story goes on as to what the magic system is. You don't kind of have to remember everything that's given to you at the start of the book. He will give you little hints and tips and reminders throughout the narrative, and it just makes it really approachable, especially if you're someone who's new to high fantasy. It can be a little bit overwhelming when you're getting all of this information about a land, about a magic system, about the culture, the folklore. It can feel a little bit overwhelming at the start, but I do think that the way that Brandon Sanderson writes it makes it really approachable, and as I say, he gives you little reminders as the narrative goes on without it being too obvious that that's what it is. So I do really enjoy the way that he writes high fantasy. The magic system in here was all to do with kind of colour and breath, and usually when you're born with one breath. The more breaths you're born with, or the more breaths that you accumulate over your life, the stronger you are. And again, I just thought that was a really interesting and unique magic system, and I think he executed it really well. I really liked the characters in here. I was really rooting for them. I think some of their characterizations were a little on the nose at times, in terms of they did have inner monologues that were basically just spelling out every emotion that they were having. There wasn't a lot of nuance in this, but I still did manage to enjoy it, and it didn't kind of take away from it. But there was some times where I was kind of thinking that could have been a little more nuanced than it was. And then I think sometimes within the middle there was a little bit of a pacing issue in terms of just letting us get to know the characters, letting us get to know the world. And while I do think that's important, this is a standalone book, so you do expect it to be a little bit more fast paced. So I think between the 1 and 20% mark it was incredibly fast paced, and it got really slow between 20 and 75, and then it obviously picked up the pace again because it has to end. So it's just those few things that made it not a 5-star for me, but I would definitely recommend this one. I would say his writing is really good. Obviously it's undisputed, he has a really good writing style. This is a standalone, so again it's a much more approachable way of looking at his work and trying to understand his writing style and maybe getting into high fantasy. I would say this is a pretty approachable book to do that. And yeah, it's made me definitely want to read on more. I ended up rating it 4 stars overall, so definitely not one of my favourites, but 4 stars is still a really good rating, and it's definitely made me want to read more of his work now. So the next book I'm going to read from him is probably The Way of Kings, which is a huge book, and starting the Stormlight Archive, which is again is a huge series, it's a huge commitment, but this has definitely made me motivated to try and do that. So yeah, all in all, a really good book. Next up is a book I read as part of the BookTuber Chooses My Reads video, and if you haven't watched that, definitely go and check it out. There's a few booktubers on there that I think you'll really enjoy if you like my content as well. So I'll link that down below, but if you haven't watched it, definitely go and check it out. So it was Bailey who was choosing my book, and she decided that I should read Blood and Steel because obviously I love romantasy. She's seen this was on my TBR, so she thought it was the perfect book to pick for that video. So in this one we're following Thea, who is living in this land where basically women aren't allowed to wield blades. There's been a prophecy for quite some time saying that basically if women wield a blade, destruction will loom on this land. And she's quite formidable, and basically for her whole life she's been training in secret to become a warrior within the land, and even though she knew there was kind of no real chance of her becoming one because of being a woman, she has always been training to try and be prepared for the day that that may happen. So after a certain scenario, Thea gets the chance to actually try to become one of these warriors and partake in an initiation test to see if she's got what it takes to become a warrior. And as part of that she gets a mentor called Wilder Hawthorne, who is basically kind of one of the top people within this legion. And of course there's going to be a little bit of a romance between them, and the story kind of goes from there. I think overall I did enjoy this one. It kept me intrigued, kept me entertained, but I would say it didn't blow me away. It wasn't anything completely new that I haven't seen before. I do think that the pacing in here was quite slow between the 30 and 70% mark. There was a lot of things happening, but nothing was happening in terms of there was nothing really adding to the plot or the overall kind of structure of the story. It was almost quite mundane, kind of the things they were going through, and considering the stakes that are in here, it did seem kind of a little bit out of place, but I do think it was to help with the world building that we were getting. So it was kind of a toss-up. We were maybe losing a little bit more of that momentum just to get that kind of establishment of the world. I really like Thea as a main character. I do think that she seemed to be quite determined, and you could tell that she almost had tunnel vision for this goal, that she wanted to become a warrior. So then it was a little bit jarring that as soon as Wilder Hawthorne came into the picture, she almost kind of let that all go. It was a lifelong kind of goal that she's had, and I do think that even though I can understand why she's getting distracted, it did kind of seem out of character for her. It did seem like it was quite a quick change. It was insta-lust. I will say it wasn't insta-love, but there was a little bit of insta-lust there, which I don't mind. You know, you can be immediately attracted to someone, of course, so that part of it didn't take away from the story for me, but I do think that the characterization weakened a little bit once he was introduced. But she did have a really good relationship with a couple of people within the guild, and I enjoyed watching their relationship blossom. So the friendships and the relationship with her sister were quite well done, but I would have liked those to be explored probably a little bit more. Considering how many mundane scenes we had in this one, I think we could have done with a bit more of an exploration of those relationships as well. We did get a lot of the relationship between Wilder and Thea, but I do think that a lot of it was quite physical. There wasn't really a lot of a connection there between them from my perception anyway. I do think this is obviously the first book that may build as the books go on, but for me it was just very physical. I didn't really buy into the connection that they had or some of the feelings that they were maybe saying that they had, because as I say, most of the interactions they had or most of the thoughts or feelings they had were how good each other looked. So I would have liked a little bit more of a kind of emotional connection between the two. And then I do think that it was a little bit predictable at times in terms of it's quite formulaic and when it comes to romanticy, and the ending wasn't really a surprise when it came there. There was a huge amount of foreshadowing in here that was pretty clear in terms of some of the secrets that may unfold as the story goes on. So again, I think that's just some of the reasons it didn't blow me away. It wasn't the worst book, it was definitely entertaining, and I do think I will read the rest of the series, but for this first book I ended up rating it 3.75. So one I enjoyed, one I would probably recommend to certain people, but just not a new favourite unfortunately. So next up I read A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher, and this one is basically a Ghost Girl retelling, and I was really highly anticipating this one because I've read Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher and really loved the writing in there. It's very whimsical but also very dark at the same time, so almost like a fairy tale horror hybrid, I would say. So I was really highly anticipating picking this one up as soon as it came out. So in this one we follow Cordelia, who is living with her mother, and her mother is pretty abusive to her, so she basically can use her magic to make her be obedient, make her be silent, and basically make her do whatever she wants. Cordelia has been kind of isolated for most of her life because of that, and she's basically just living with her mother while her mother tries to find a rich husband to get them out of the situation that they're currently in. So her mother ends up finding someone to marry. She finds a rich squire who she's trying to basically manipulate into marrying her. So her mother and Cordelia go there to kind of live with this squire as friends so that her mother can try and charm him and get him to marry her. Now when they get there, the squire's sister Hester kind of figures out that there's something a little bit strange about Cordelia's mother. She doesn't really like her straight away. She feels like she seems quite evil, but she can't quite pinpoint on what it is. And Hester decides to try and take Cordelia under her wing and figure out what the issue is with her mother and basically try to stop her brother from proposing or marrying her. And the story kind of goes from there, but with this one I would say that overall it had a good balance of kind of eerie and unsettling themes with a bit of satire and comic relief thrown in there. It's quite a short book, but I did find the characters quite compelling and complex. Felt like we did really get to know them and we got to know the layers of them, some of their backstories, and it really is a character arc kind of following Cordelia and her growth throughout the story. And I did like that by the time the book finished, Cordelia did end up being, you know, still quite similar to her initial character, so it wasn't this complete turnaround. She still was quite timid and quiet and reserved, but it was almost watching her inner strength grow, so I really enjoyed that. I loved the relationships between the older characters, so Hester, the squire's sister, she did have a little group of friends that kind of came in, and I really loved their relationship, their banter, and how they took Cordelia under their wing. It felt really real, the relationships felt true, and again they were providing a lot of comic relief throughout the narrative. I maybe would have liked to delve more into the darker parts of this story and kind of some of the horror elements as well. There was little snippets of it here and there, but really this kind of just felt like a Regency story. The magic elements were pretty minimal in here, and if you kind of took those out, I think the story would have been pretty much the same if we just made the mother evil in some way. I don't really think the magical elements of it were necessary to this story, and because of that it did feel like some of the plot points were a little bit slow and mundane, and we weren't really getting a lot of action on the page. So again, it might have been nice to kind of delve into Cordelia's mother's background, how she got her magic, why she's magical while Cordelia's not magical. A lot of that was missed out because it is quite a short book, but I think there was a lot of detail in here about the characters and their backstories that maybe wasn't as relevant to the narrative as that maybe would have been, and maybe would have brought it up to a higher rating for me. But I think overall it was both wholesome and horrifying, so if you do like a fairy tale retelling, it's whimsical but has that little dark side as well, I would definitely recommend picking this up because her writing's beautiful, the prose in here were beautiful. I would still recommend this to anyone that enjoys T. Kingfisher because I do think the writing was comparable to Nettle and Bone. For me personally, the plot and the storyline just wasn't as good as that, so I ended up rating this one 3.25. So again, not a favourite unfortunately, but still one I would recommend to certain people. So from the last two roundups you can probably tell I was getting into a little bit of a slump because some of the books that I was reading were quite slow paced, and reading that back to back sometimes can make me go into a little bit of a slump. I do like something that's a bit more fast paced, a bit more action on the page, or at least to have it broken up, to have, you know, each consecutive read, one's maybe action packed then a little bit slower. So I was feeling like I was getting into a little bit of a slump, so anytime I'm feeling that I usually pick up either a reread or I'll pick up kind of a fluffy romance that I just want to read to kind of break the chain. So I decided to pick up Off to the Races by Elsie Silver. So this was one of my 10 before the end, so I took it as an opportunity to squeeze this into my TBR for November. So in this one we follow Fawn and Billy. So Fawn works on a farm. I can't actually remember exactly what his job is, but he works on a farm basically that has horses on there. One of them is essentially a racehorse, and Billy comes onto the scene because she's basically a horse trainer and she's coming on to try and get the horse up to speed so they can perhaps put her into a race. So obviously the two of these meet, obviously they hate each other at the start, obviously there's a lot of clashing between the two, while also some angsty kind of feelings about them, and overall this was okay. I did enjoy it. It's definitely evident that this is her first book. I do think that the Chestnut Spring Spring series were much better than this. I feel like I connected to the characters a lot more in the Chestnut Spring series. This one is definitely just one of those books if you're feeling in a bit of a rut, you want to read something that's a bit fast, a bit entertaining, has a little bit of spice in there as well, doesn't take too much brain power. I would definitely say to read this one. I ended up rating this one 3 stars. Again, I was coming out of a slump, so that may reflect in how I felt about this one, but it definitely helped me break out of that slump a little bit because it was just easy, no kind of thinking reading. But yeah, it definitely wasn't as good as the Chestnut Spring series so far, I would say. So I'm still interested in reading the rest of this series. I do believe that the rest of the books within this initial series do get better, but I do think that it's evident that this is one of her first romance books, and I definitely think that I can see how much her writing has progressed from this first series to the Chestnut Spring series. So yeah, this one again, just middle of the road. If you like Elsie Silver, you probably will still enjoy it. If you like romance, you'll probably enjoy it, but again, just definitely not one of my new favourites. So next up, because I was still feeling in a little bit of a slump, I just wanted something that was again just going to be a fun, fast read. So I ended up really randomly picking up The Winter King by C.L. Wilson. So I'll put a picture of it on the screen. I don't have it physically. I read it on my Kindle. And basically this is one for any of the romantasy girls out there who love a story that has a fantasy setting but has a heavy romance plot. This is definitely one for you. So we're following our main character, Winter, who is obviously devilishly handsome and is seeking his revenge on the Summerlee King after a 3-year-long war, and to do that he's going to take basically one of his beloved daughters for his bride. So if you can't tell from that kind of short description, it's a bit of a Beauty and the Beast retelling. So he's basically going to the Summerlee court to take one of the king's daughters as basically his vengeance for winning the war over this land. He does, however, have a bit of a dark secret because he is battling what is called the Ice Heart. So it's basically a power that is going to be taking over him. And since his brother's death, he's been embracing that power, and that may lead to trouble as the story goes on. Tamsin is a princess within the Summerlee court and has been kind of isolated within this land because her father blames her for her mother's death. And the king of the Summerlee court comes up with a cunning plan to basically trick Winter into taking Tamsin as his bride so that he doesn't give up one of the daughters that he actually loves. So the story goes on from there. Basically, Tamsin goes with Winter to his own land to become his bride. Obviously they're enemies at the start, you know, they absolutely hate each other. There's also kind of a side story about Tamsin's brother and him being missing, and she definitely blames Winter for that as well. And I think this one, again, it was a little bit ridiculous at times. Definitely insta-lusty, probably a bit insta-lovey as well, but I do think that's exactly what it promises on the tin, so you can't really complain about that when you're going into reading it. But I do think that the author turned it into kind of an insta-lust to love, so it did kind of seem like a natural progression. I wasn't kind of rolling my eyes too much when they started to say that they did have feelings, because they definitely were shown to have battling emotions about it, so it wasn't kind of a as soon as they saw each other they were in love. And I would say that the romance was definitely at the forefront of this one, but I got a lot more background plot than I was actually expecting with this, especially because the spice kicked in this pretty quickly. I thought this was basically just going to be a full romance in a fantasy setting, but I do think that the author did put a lot of effort into making that fantasy plot in the background really intriguing. The world was pretty well built, you know, you did get kind of a middle ground fantasy plot within there, and I really did find myself struggling to put it down because I wanted to see what was going to happen. That being said, I did have a few problems with the narrative that meant I knew it wasn't going to be a 5-star for me. So basically the MMC meets the FMC, thinking that she's a maid. She's kind of in a disguise as a maid in the castle, and essentially he does sexually assault her. So that kind of stopped me being invested in the relationship. You know, it is kind of explained later in the story as to why it happened, but I think once you have something like that on page, it's quite difficult to then root for that character to get his happy ending. But I don't think that the way that it was written was necessarily needed to portray the message that the author was trying to, and that is vague, but if you've read it you may understand what I mean by that. I do think that there was a narrative and a string within the narrative that she was trying to portray, but I don't think the actions of the character were necessarily needed to prove that point. And while I think the plot in the background was well developed, I think the world building in terms of the setting was a little bit lacking, so sometimes I was struggling to picture the scene, even though I knew exactly what the plot was doing, and the plot did actually go quite deep. I think the actual settings were a little bit lackluster for me, so again it just meant it was a little bit hard for me to envisage it. And I do think as well that some parts were a little bit slower. I don't think it was as bad as the books that I'd read previously, but some parts felt a little bit slow, and it was a pretty long book, so I do think that it could have been edited quite a bit just to make it a bit more succinct. But I do think overall it was really enjoyable. It's definitely one for anyone who likes romantasy. It did help me get out of the slump that I was in, so I obviously did enjoy it and it did keep me entertained. But overall I did rate it 3.75. I don't think it's going to be one that I'm going to scream from the rooftops about, but definitely anyone that likes a really romance heavy story in a fantasy setting, I think they would really enjoy this one. So next up I read Lady Macbeth by Ava Reid, and this is basically a reimagining of Macbeth but from the female male protagonist Lady Macbeth's point of view. So it's tipped as being kind of a feminist retelling. There's a lot of feminist rhetoric in here, and it's basically just following our main character Roskilde, who is Lady Macbeth, as she goes on her journey, marries Macbeth, and kind of just watching her relationship with him, relationship within the court, and kind of how she influences that as well. I think with this one, definitely true to Eva Reid's writing style. If it's something to do with anything that's gothic or atmospheric, I do think she's got a really good talent for that. I think she's proven to be quite a firm favourite for me in terms of her writing style and her atmosphere that she builds. I think as soon as I started reading it, there was quite a few quotable lines that I could highlight in here, and I was quickly immersed into the world that she was building. I don't quite remember the narrative to Macbeth, and I don't exactly remember the story fully, so in terms of how true this stays to that story, I can't really comment, but I do know from other reviews that I think this does veer off quite a lot, and I think she was quite liberal with her retelling of this story. I think there's quite a lot of liberties that were taken with this one, but again, I can't say that from personal experience because I have read Macbeth, but it was quite a long time ago, so I can't exactly remember all of the details. I would say though, even though the atmosphere and the setting for this one and the writing was perfect, I would have liked a little bit more from the plot and the characters. I feel like the plot was extremely simplistic. There wasn't really a lot to kind of pull you in, and then in terms of the characters, again, I just felt they fell a little bit flat for me. They were a little bit like caricatures, and I didn't really feel myself connecting with any of them. And I do think that this is hailed to be kind of a feminist reimagining or retelling of Macbeth, but I didn't really see kind of where those elements came in, other than saying that basically Roskilde was the only good person, or the only good people were women within this story. All of the men were terrible people, and therefore Lady Macbeth was justified in all of her actions. And for me personally, I would have just liked it to be maybe a little bit more balanced, but us exploring kind of her evil side and kind of that saying where I support women's rights and I support women's wrongs, delving into some of that, and again just taking the perspective from Lady Macbeth and highlighting that rather than it just being a men are bad, women are good kind of narrative. And that is how it felt to me. I don't think it was as nuanced as I was anticipating, so it did kind of take away from that element for me. And then when it came to the ending, I do think that it was a little bit rushed. There was not a lot of story time in this. I think there's only like 290 pages or something like that, but I do think it was trying to be a bit of a character study, and because the characters were falling a little bit flat, it didn't really land the way I feel like it should have, and the ending then felt rushed because there was a lot of action at the end, but it just felt like it was squeezed into the most minimal amount of pages to get it done. So overall, I did enjoy this. I ended up giving it 4 stars, mainly because I really enjoyed the writing, really enjoyed the atmosphere. I think it's a quick read. I think if you've got a gloomy day, you have a few hours to sit down, a nice hot drink, this would be a perfect atmospheric read for the winter time. But I would say that for me personally, I didn't enjoy the plot as much as I was hoping to, and definitely the feminist aspects in here were a little bit lacking for me. So yeah, not a favourite from Eva for me, but definitely would recommend to anyone who likes her writing or a gothic kind of reimagining. This would probably be right up your street. Next up, I read one of my most anticipated reads for the year, and I'm happy to say that it didn't disappoint. I absolutely loved it. So it's The Songbird and the Heart of Stone by Carissa Broadbent, and this one is following Misha, who is basically almost like a side character within the first duet in the Crowns of Nyaxia series. So we get little kind of tidbits about her life, and she's very much a side character. She's a very sunshine character, very cheery, but you can kind of tell there's a bit of a darkness there and a bit of a history to her. But obviously within the first duet we're following Rain and Aurea, so we don't really get a lot of her story in there. But she was definitely a character that stood out to me and one that I wanted to know more about. So when Carissa Broadbent said that she was bringing out a series kind of following her journey, I was really excited to pick it up. So because this does kind of have ties to the first 2 books, I don't want to give too much about the synopsis, but essentially we've got a main character who is quite a sunshine character who ends up meeting with essentially the Lord of the Underworld, and she set a task with him to kind of delve into the depths of the Underworld for this mission, and the story kind of goes from there. So it really is just following her and our MMC Asar, who is the Lord of the Underworld, going on this mission together. And obviously one is quite bubbly and sunshine, the other one is dark, gloomy and grumpy. There's definitely a bit of a forbidden love element within there, and we definitely get to see a lot more under Misha's sunny demeanour, kind of the dark past that's under there, why she has a bit of darkness within her, and maybe why she puts on this kind of sunny facade. And I'd say if you didn't love her before this book, you definitely will after you've read this one. And I think this is one that helped me giggling 1 minute at Misha's one-liners and then tearing up the next minute because of the sadness of her history and her past, and I cannot wait to get back into this world with the 4th book within the series, but the 2nd book in this duology, just to see where they end up. The way this one ended had me in a chokehold, so definitely cannot wait to see the next book in this series. And overall I ended up rating this one 5 stars. Next up, I read The Everking by LJ Andrews, and this is the first in the Everking duology. I'm not sure if it has a different name, but this is the first in that duology. I believe the second book is called The Ever Queen. And this series is actually linked to another series that I've read by LJ Andrews, so the Broken Kingdom series. This is a follow-on kind of spin-off series from that, I would say. So it follows the children from that first series, and even though I would say you could read this one alone, I definitely found that I got a lot more insight and a lot more connection with the characters because I had read that series. Now, it's a 9-book series, so obviously if you don't have time to read all of that, or if you don't want to get as invested in that just to read this one, this book will still make sense if you haven't read those 9 books because it is connected, but it's definitely not detrimental to the story if you don't have that background. So in this one we follow our main character, the Ever King, so Eric, who is essentially seeking vengeance on the Earth Fae for stealing his crown and killing his father. So it's been 10 years since the war that was waged between his family and the Earth Fae, and he's been waiting patiently for his chance to get vengeance on the Earth Fae King. So the Earth Fae had actually made him a prisoner within his own realm. He hadn't been able to leave the Everseas for the last 10 years, but something happens which means he is able to break out from that, and essentially as part of his vengeance to the Earth Fae, he decides to kidnap his daughter and hold her at ransom for his revenge. So of course this one is a little bit of an enemies to lovers story, close proximity. You will get a deeper dive into the characters within this one. I would say it's definitely romance forward, so this is definitely for someone who enjoys a bit more romantasy than kind of a high fantasy. The romance is the main plot here, but again, with some of the other ones that I've read, the backstory and kind of the fantasy plot going on in the background is actually quite well developed in this one, and I really enjoyed it in the Broken Kingdoms, and it seems that LJ Andrews is continuing that with this series as well. So for anyone that does like high fantasy, if you're looking for something that will give you a bit of a break from those more heavy reads, this is definitely one that I would still recommend because I think the political intrigue within here will still keep you invested in the story. But just be warned that the romance is kind of the overall plot in this one, so it does kind of stand at the forefront. There was a good twist at the end. There was quite a few twists at the end actually, which had me really intrigued to read the second one, so I wasn't really worried about this. I've read a lot from LJ Andrews in the past. I pretty much knew that I was probably going to enjoy this, so ended up rating it pretty much in line with the rest of her books, 4 stars. So yeah, really excited to continue the series for this one. Next up I read For the Wolf by Hannah Witten. So this one has been on my TBR for so long. I think it's 2 years now that it's been on my TBR. I got it as a Christmas present, not last year but the year before, and I thought it's finally time. I really need to pick this one up. So despite the cover, this one is actually a bit more of a Beauty and the Beast retelling. So the main character is called Redaris, but other than some minimal elements of the story, this is definitely much more of a Beauty and the Beast retelling. So basically in this one we follow 2 princesses. One is For the Wolf, as the title would suggest, and the other is For the Throne. So basically the second daughter within the land is always sacrificed to the wolf, who is basically this entity within the wilder wood that takes their life sacrifice to keep the land safe and keep the wilder wood kind of contained where it is. So in this story we're following Redaris as she is being sacrificed to the wilder wood and to that wolf. When she gets there, obviously things may not be as she had thought they would be. We're watching her uncover some of the secrets and mysteries of the wilder wood, but we do also get the point of view from her sister Navara, so Neva as she's called for short, as she's trying to hatch a plan to save her sister from the wilder wood as well. So we do get some of her POVs breaking up the narrative within here as well. So this one I'm a little bit conflicted because I do think that overall I enjoyed it, but there were a few elements of it that left a lot to be desired. But start off with what I liked. I think Hannah Witten is a master of building atmosphere, and she definitely delivered with this in terms of building a eerie fairy tale folklore retelling, and I definitely enjoyed watching the development of the characters within, and especially that of Red and Neve. I do think that their characters were pretty well developed, if a little bit cliche for this type of story. I do think that we got a good delve into kind of their intentions and their motivations, so I really enjoyed that side of it as well. I think the main aspect of this that maybe took away from my enjoyment was the world building and the history and the folklore. In terms of the wilder wood especially, kind of the wolf's connection to it, I feel like it was a little bit flimsy at times, and I kind of found myself thinking I had missed some details and trying to read back to see if I'd missed something, but just turns out some things just aren't explained within this book. And that did take me out of the story a little bit because I felt that sometimes the narrative was quite convoluted in giving us information, but it didn't actually add or answer any of the questions that I had about the narrative or about the history of this story. So it did definitely take me out of the story a little bit. I felt that the narrative was a little bit convoluted at times and adding maybe useless information that didn't really add to the overall narrative but was maybe filler for the story. It may come into play in the second book, but going off just this first book, it definitely felt like there was a lot of information given to us that didn't necessarily push on the plot or help with my understanding of it. I will say however that the ending of this one got me very excited about where book 2 is going to go, and again some of the questions that I have may be answered there, so definitely excited to pick that one up, and I will be picking that up in December, so I'm hoping I will enjoy it. This one I ended up rating 3.5 just because, as I say, the world building was a little bit lacking, and I think the promise of that deeper dive was there, but we just never got it delivered within this one, so ended up rating this one 3.5 overall. And then last last but not least, I would say my favourite read of the month, and potentially one of my favourite reads this year, is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. And this one, I love this. It was so good. It's been on my TBR for so long. I've been kind of side-eyeing it for around a year or so because it is sci-fi, which is a genre I don't normally pick up. It's one that I had kind of categorized in a box of not for me. Anything set in space, anything with that more sci-fi edge to it. I just kind of thought that's not for me. Happy that people enjoy it. Glad there's a lot of options out there, but not something I think I will ever explore. This has kind of changed my perspective on that because of how much I enjoyed it, and I definitely think that it's proven that no matter what the genre, there's a book out there for you if you find the right one. So I will try and give a bit of an explanation about what this one's about. It does get a little bit confusing, but basically we're following Gideon, who has been an orphan on this planet, Ninth House, for her entire life. Basically she's been brought up by these nuns and skeletons and has basically been in servitude to the heir of the Ninth House for her entire life. The heir of the Ninth House is Harrow, who has always had a very contentious relationship with Gideon. They've never really got on, they've always been enemies, and Gideon has actually been trying to plan to leave this planet for her entire life. At the start of the story she is actually planning to leave, but gets caught by Harrow at the last minute and ends up getting roped into becoming a cavalier for Harrow, as Harrow has been invited to the First House, which is another planet within this land, to take part in essentially trials to become what is called a lictor, who is an immortal with, you know, immense power and serves directly to the Emperor of the First House. So that's very simplistically what this story is about. It's basically a story about trials between all these different planets. Every heir from the planets get invited. The heirs of the planets are also necromancers. I didn't mention that, but they're all necromancers coming to try and win a place as a lictor using their wit and will, and basically a ragtag group of people coming together to try out for this position. I feel like the story did get a little bit confusing at times, and it's definitely one of those ones I would say just stick with it. The plot line is pretty simplistic in terms of you'll know what's happening in the moment, but the overall picture will not become clear until later in the story, but you just kind of have to go with it. There are going to be things that you don't really understand, some things that you don't really maybe comprehend until later in the story. Just go with it. It will click. It will click eventually. I think the world that Tamsin Muir built here is really rich and dense, and I was definitely really impressed with that. Again, I don't read sci-fi a lot, so it could be pretty basic, but for me personally it felt really unique. And I think for me, quite honestly, the characters are what really made me invested in this. So the main FMC, Gideon, is a snarky, lovable badass who could kill you within 2 seconds but has a really huge heart, and you can tell that through her interactions with some of the other people within the trials. I felt all of the characters were layered and nuanced, and we really got to understand their backgrounds, but a lot of them kept us guessing. You know, we didn't really understand their motivations fully, we didn't know who we could actually trust, and there is kind of a mystery subplot going on throughout this, so again that keeps you intrigued and keeps you entertained. There was a lot of comic relief in here, but it definitely has some sad and tender moments in here as well, so it's something that I wasn't expecting, but again just helped me really get connected with the characters in here. And the way that this one ended just makes me want to pick up the next book ASAP. It isn't technically on my December TBR, but it's definitely one I'm going to be trying to squeeze in, and for these I would definitely highly recommend the audiobooks. I think the narrator was phenomenal. She really brought the characters to life for me, so if you are going to read this one, I would suggest an immersive reading experience, so reading along while you're listening to the audiobook as well. Highly recommend. I think that just made the experience 100 times better. But yeah, this one, 5 stars, absolutely, no doubt about it. I couldn't have given any less. Definitely one of my top reads of the year, I would say. So that's everything I read in November. As I say, I think I had a bit of a rocky start. I ended up getting into a bit of a slump, but overall I'd say I had a pretty good month. I've got some new favourites here, started some new series that I've really loved, some new authors I'll be interested in checking out some of their other works as well, so let me know if you've read any of these, what your thoughts and feelings were about them, if there's any books you think I'd enjoy based on my enjoyment of these. Definitely put those in the comments below, and also let me know what your favourite read was for November. If you like this video, do remember to give it a like, and if you want to see more from me, remember to subscribe. I'm posting 2 videos per week, and it's videos like this, so wrap-ups, book recommendation videos, book hauls, book shopping videos, all good bookish things like that. Other than that, thanks so much for watching this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one soon. Bye!